Right, well, welcome to another Black History Conversations. It's great to have folks joining us, and it's great to know that folks are following up with the recordings. Friday lunchtime isn't always such a convenient time, but back in the day, in October 2020, I think we started, so many of us were in lockdown that Friday lunchtime seemed like a good opportunity to get together. Anyway, I'm Liz Millman from Learning Links International, and today I've got with me my colleague Caroline Sansom, and also Simon Fringo is operating the technical side of things and supporting the whole management of this, and he's from Belong, Nottingham. So this week's session is carrying on with exploring local stories, the local stories of Black history. So we're really interested for folks to ask people in their own areas and try to find out if there's anyone in your local area that is exploring the stories of local history. That's anywhere in the UK and anywhere in the world. So I'm going to share today my local history story, which is about Day 26, Australia's Invasion Day. Now, the 26th of January is Australia Day, but it's got all sorts of different names now, and you'll understand why. So we're going to be exploring how best to carry out and share this sort of community-based research. My community-based research, I confess, was entirely off the television on Wednesday, but I have been getting out and about as well, but it's been hard here to know, but I certainly have been taking a very active interest in what's been going on with the campaigning. So just on this slide, before I move on to the next one, we've got Harold Thomas, who designed the Aboriginal flag, and the Australian government's now bought the copyright for it, so anybody can use that to recognise the Aboriginal culture. They also use the Torres Strait Islanders flag, but that obviously was out of copyright. And interestingly, we catch up here eventually in Australia. This is a statue of Captain Cook, and it isn't on a lovely evening with the sun shining on it. It's actually painted red. So there has been some campaigning going on over here. Okay, so Australia Day, reflect, respect and celebrate. That's the official national thing, and you can look up Australia Day. You can also find illustrations of the Sydney Opera House, and I'll tell you more about that story that was projected onto there in a little while. And then also about the 50 years of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. I'm going to be talking about that. But because I'm in Australia, over the last few years, it's been considered respectful to start any meeting with an acknowledgement. So I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, their elders past, present and future, because this land belongs to the sovereign people of the First Nations and was never ceded. It always was and it always will be. Okay, so I'm going to be telling you a little bit more in a while about this recognition. So this was in 1988 when Vernon arrived in England at the White Cliffs of Dover. I don't know if you can see him there. And he decided to claim Britain for the Aboriginal people. And this story has been remembered again and again, but I just think it's so brilliant, and it was designed to be so satirical, and it certainly was. So I'll just read a little bit here from the transcription of his words. I, Vernon, being a nobleman of the ancient Australia, do hereby take possession of England on behalf of the Aboriginal people. In claiming this colonial outpost, we wish no harm to you natives, but assure you we are here to bring you good manners, refinement, and an opportunity to make a kumpatu, a fresh start. And henceforth, all Aboriginal and Aboriginal face shall appear on your coins and stamps to signify our sovereignty over this domain. I think I may on my later PowerPoint have the whole of this statement, but it's amazing. Oh no, here he goes. For the more advanced, we will bring the complex language of the Pitjantjatjara, and we will teach you how to have a spiritual relationship with the earth and show you how to get bush tucker. We do not intend, said Burrum Burrum, to souvenir, pickle, preserve the heads of 2,000 of your people, nor publicly display the skeletal remains of your Royal Highness, as was done to our Queen, Druganini, for 80 years. Neither do we intend to poison your waterholes, lace your flour with strychnine, or introduce you to highly toxic drugs. Based on our 50,000-year heritage, we acknowledge the need to preserve the Caucasian race as of interest to antiquity. And although we may be inclined to conduct experiments by measuring the size of your skulls for levels of intelligence. So this was his satirical way of claiming England, as Arthur Phillip had done to Vernon Burnham's homeland in 1788 when arriving with the First Fleet. So it was, I think, really interesting to see that and to hear about that, because it twists it round, and there are some brilliant Aboriginal comics over here who and presenters who are really challenging things now. So as I said, we're exploring Black history, moving forward and rethinking how to tell local stories of Black history found across the UK. So I contacted Kent local history group to ask them what they knew about the Burrum Burrum story. I'm laughing here because I had a reply from the local history group in Kent in Massachusetts. I've got the wrong group. So I also contacted some folks in Dorset and promised that I would say a little bit about their organisation, because they find with their resources they're limited, and they weren't able to come and share their own story. So it'll be interesting at some stage to have a look at what they've done, because they've used a virtual Black history resource online, which has got all sorts of different key figures and stories to do with Kent. Right, on to the next one. Oh, just to remind folks that there's a conference call for abstracts. I don't know if anybody here is interested. This is the 46th annual conference of the Caribbean Studies Association. I don't know if Bernard and Vivian, you get involved with this, but it's about reframing Caribbean influences on global spaces, critically engaging perspectives on human geography of risks, political economy and technology. It sounds a bit academic for me, but there may be others here who are interested in that, and I can send you the information. Lisa Gabbard in Texas has sent us the information about this book. I'm sorry I couldn't manage to take the photograph of the whole book. Critical Perspectives on Empire, Imperial Emotions, the Politics of Empathy Across the British Empire. I would have thought that a book on the politics of empathy across the British Empire would have been quite a thin book, but it looked quite fat from the photograph. So we need to get somebody to read that and report back on that. Okay, that's we were talking about that earlier. That's the link there. Sorry. Okay, and this is interesting. Was sent to me just now. Thank you, Simon. It's Oceans Apart, Visions of British Caribbean Artists. So online you can have a look at that. And I certainly know Stanley Burke from Birmingham, and some of his works are going to appear in that past 70 years of British history. And that's an interesting way of connecting with local history, that if you have had someone in the community, like Birmingham's lucky enough to have Stanley Burke, then his story of the past, I don't think it's quite 70 years, but it's at least 50 years, is fascinating. Okay, so I also discovered, I'm just going to go through this lot first, of things that are coming up and perhaps interesting. There's now, the Open University have launched Open Learn, and this is a great idea because there are all sorts of very short courses, sort of from 25 minutes, to longer courses, which are 12 hours, to all sorts of other things. So this is an opportunity. They're just setting this up at the moment. And Caroline, I've written to them and suggested that the project we did, From Sheep to Sugar, that would make a really good course. So who knows whether we'll manage to go down that line. So the ones I've picked out are Historical Perspectives on Race, which is a 12-hour programme. Then a short course, Deconstructing the Moors, Black Presence in the United Kingdom before and during the Tudor period. And that's Dr. Carol J. Brown Linardi, which sounds interesting. So I know, Apabagamadden, you're looking at the whole thing of how to present Black history. And certainly for schools to have a resource about Black history, a resource that's being updated about the Black history in local areas, and we think probably county by county and city by city, town by town, would be a really, really good first step. But then there's also resources like this that teachers can access if they want to find out more about particular subjects. Right, so this is on Scotland's links to Caribbean slavery, which is an Open Learn course. So they talk about Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee making large fortunes from this slavery. So Glasgow University has done a lot of research, and I think I've got something about that in a moment. All right, Ian Mccracken told us last week about the SOGA Studies Conference, which is interesting because that's in South Africa. So I don't know whether Bernard or Vivian, whether you'd be able to be involved in that. Certainly interesting. You're okay to talk back to me, I just can't see you at the moment while I've got the big screen on. And also looking at other sorts of Black history, and French Black history is really interesting to me. And there was a TV program here. Sounds as if I watch the TV all the time. Truth is I do. And there was a program about Versailles and the fabulous food that was created for the monarch and his courtiers. Because of course all these wonderful things like sugar and other products were available because of the French Empire. So that's another interesting one. It is presented in English, this website, so you can choose. Then the James McEwen Smith Scholarships will fund Black UK students to undertake PhD research at university. Don't know if that's of interest to anyone. You can find that out. That's the University of Glasgow. At the University of Greenwich, we've got a call for conference papers on neo-slave narratives. Quite sure what that means, but there's time for people to find out about that. Oh, here it is. An original African, American and Caribbean slave narratives of the 18th and 19th centuries, for example. And then we've got Alua, Equiano, Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass. Now these characters and their wonderful work, they toured Britain. So when you come to local history, as Ian Mccracken did last week, he was talking about these people actually speaking in Glasgow. So that sounds as if to be interesting. Oops. Oh yes, and just to say that Patrick Vernon has been appointed Honorary Professor at the University of Wolverhampton. It's good, isn't it, Apu? Caroline knows Wolverhampton too. So we'll get in touch with him and see, because he's been leading the campaign for Windrush Day and justice for the Windrush generation following the Windrush scandal. So maybe we can get him to come and talk with us one time. Okay, this is specially to remind you, Jim, that we do want to do a session or two about indentured labour. We've not forgotten those sorts of themes. Well, but more recently we've just been looking at local histories. Okay, right. Yeah, Blood and Fire, Jamaican political history documentary. Don't know if you know that one, Bernard or Vivian. Certainly interesting. So I haven't managed to get to watch that yet, but there's the YouTube link.
Sorry, Liz. I'm young enough. Young enough to share with you that I heard when those words were spoken.
Really?
Yep.
Tell us.
What is now National Heroes Park?
Oh, right.
That is for another time. I would have to travel with my rum and my jerk chicken.
Right. Right. We'll hold you to that, all right?
That discussion would last for 3 weeks.
All right. Okay. When we get together, we've got to do some interviewing with you and get some of your stories, and that's fantastic. It's really, really good. Right, okay, then just to remember that Betty Campbell, this is especially here for you, Apu. It isn't really, but it is important to recognise that Betty Campbell, as Wales's first black head teacher and Black History campaigner, and this lovely statue has been unveiled. So, you know, I've really, really missed being in Wales, because lots of exciting things have been happening while I've been over here. So probably keep out of the way, and then exciting things will carry on happening. Okay. Right. And this is something to do. Oh, yes, there's this interesting podcast about Caribbean convicts in Australia. So I'll do some more on that again, and I'm just going to stop sharing this one now, and I'm just going to see if there are any questions or points or anything about any of those things, so that we do the update first this time. We usually do it the other way around. Okay. So I wanted to, if it's all right with you, to now go through the information that we had last week from, sorry,
just a question for my information. And Dr. Jim will perhaps answer this. I didn't know that the Indians arrived in England as indentured laborers. Did they? For what?
No.
Oh,
Jim,
okay.
do you want to answer that?
The thing is, it's difficult to identify indentured laborers because from India, the rich who came to England, they were mainly students.
Okay.
They did work in a way where they could, but you know, workers have came in through the ships and so on, and the merchant ships, and they were indentured in a way. They signed a contract for 7 years or whatever, but not as the indentured ship that worked on the plantation. There's a difference in terms of work contracts, but you need to look in the broader sense rather than just the indentureship. It's about people expending their labor for free or for poverty wage, and it's a single word. Indentureship doesn't really reflect the whole cross-section of exploitation of people from the Caribbean and from the Asian subcontinent and Africa.
Yes.
But
well,
more
thank
work
you
needs to be done on this.
Yes, but thank you very much, because from Jamaica, we are indebted to the Indians. They came 1845 as indentured laborers. And I said we are indebted to them in terms of the cuisine, the curry, and they taught us to eat vegetables.
Curry goat, man, curry goat, brother.
and they taught us the beauty of herb, quote unquote herb.
All right, well, when we get round to seeing, oh, sorry, before I say that, Jim did a whole conversation session and told us about his life, Vivian, and that's recorded because Jim's parents were, and Jim is a descendant of indentured labourers from Guyana who were taken to Guyana. And that was a very, very moving session and a difficult session, but it's important that we do understand that aspect of the British Empire, British activities, which the more I'm learning about, the more horrified I am. I'm just going to try and share the screen with the PowerPoint of Black History in Scotland. Ah, yes, here it is. Oops. Can you see that?
Yep,
Good.
can see that.
Thank you. Right, now last week Ian Mccracken joined us. He can't join us this week, but I said I'd still go through and see whether this sort of approach is a useful approach, because we can want to help people. So Ian very kindly gave us all the links to all these things, and I've made it into a PowerPoint, so we'll just look through. So Ian's a librarian and independent researcher. He's done some work for the University of Glasgow, but he's very much an independent, working on his own during the difficult COVID times. Right, so this is how we promoted the session last week, and he's very happy to have people contact him, iangmccracken@gmail.com. And this PowerPoint was produced to illustrate the great range of resources that there are in Glasgow, as he presented last week. This book is great. It's called It Was Naos. I can't say it in a Scots accent, and we haven't got David with us today to say it, so he sends his apologies. So Stephen Mullen wrote this book, The Truth About Glasgow and Slavery. Pretty obvious that Glasgow was involved in the slave trade when it's got streets with names like Jamaica Street. But the website's been produced based on the book, and it's absolutely brilliant. So because Scotland's role in the slave trade's long been a contentious issue, as we're discovering in our discussions about earlier, with the challenges that are being made at the moment over in discussions in Scotland. Scotland's role in the slave trade has been certainly a contentious, and still is a contentious issue. And in modern times, a myth of denial has evolved. So it's really important, because it had almost casually been accepted in Scotland that it was Naos. And I have to say, I really thought that the English were the worst of the perpetrators, but the more you get into understanding our shared Black histories, the Welsh and the Scots were much involved, as were the Irish, all for different reasons. So Glasgow's built heritage, tobacco, the slave trade and abolition. We don't have slaves up here, is one of the quotes. So that's really worth having a look at. So I was delighted that he brought that to our attention. Now, Glasgow University has the Benin Centre for Slavery Studies and slavery-related research projects. And it's really interesting now we're beginning to understand what academics are doing and what they're finding out about. And there's also a new educational resource from the University of Glasgow, and they've made a fictional Caribbean island created with Minecraft. I have to say, I don't really understand this, to help students visualize plantations and their environs in the 18th and 19th centuries. So teachers and students can explore all over the island to complete tasks, find information, or simply gain a better appreciation of how they appeared. So it'd probably be a good idea if a few folks had a look at that and saw exactly what it was like, because we do hear horror stories of teachers thinking it's a jolly good idea to get the children dressing up as slaves and thinking what it would have been like. That was a story from a few years back. But also there's a great comic book, and it's called Freedom Bound, and it's about slaves escaping slavery in Scotland, because I didn't honestly realise this, but there are lots of stories now about Africans who were enslaved in Britain. So that's an interesting approach as well, while we're looking at how we can tell the stories to children. And sometimes, just sometimes, the local perspective is a bit too close, and maybe it's easier to look at some Black history stories from other areas and then come back to your own area. So you can see there's lots of slavery related research projects. And I'm wondering, Vivian, how you and Bernard, how do you know about what's going on about your countries in other countries? How do you know what research is going on? It seems there's so much. Okay, so get on to the next one. But did you want to come back on that, Vivian?
Well, I just jump in this to say that we do have some knowledge of research going on in the area, because, for example, we do have fairly strong links with the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of the West Indies, and I in fact participate in their seminar series. In fact, there is one this afternoon, so I'll be online for practically all of today. So yes, we are aware, and we do engage from time to time.
And Bernard, if there are events going on that it's possible for others to join from outside Jamaica, would you, if you hear about them, would you let us know?
Sure.
Because now we can talk to one another all around the world, then we can access information and join courses and meetings and things all around the world. There's every opportunity.
Yes, I will do.
Okay, thanks very much. That's really interesting. Because, sorry.
I yield to you.
Difficult. Okay, right. I mean, one of the reasons I'm raising it is that people in communities in the UK often have absolutely no idea what's going on in the universities in their own towns and cities. So when it comes to Black history, I know in Wolverhampton they've made an effort in the last few years to engage the university teams in Black History Month, but it wasn't always that way. It was that the Black communities were having to tell their own stories. So this was another story that Ian told us about Arthur Roberts on the front line, his military service and his diaries and memoirs are a portrait of his personal journey. And his story remained unknown and unpublished until a chance find 20 years after his death. So the information, which I think is put out by English Heritage, very interesting story. So that's another thing that Ian had found. As I say, Ian was just researching about his own city, Glasgow. Oops, that was the list of things that. So just to explain, so what happened was that Ian put in the chat all these links and talked them through with all of us. And what I'm doing is trying to help now so that Ian will have a PowerPoint presentation that he can use if useful. So I want to find out, how you feel about this sort of approach to sharing. Now, what I could, if you're using this PowerPoint yourself, if it had come on the, you got it off the website or you got it off an email, then you'd be able to action these links. But because I'm on screen sharing, if I action that, it's not actually the screen that I'm sharing, and I have to stop and go into that, and it's quite cumbersome, so I'm not going to do that, but this is a stepping stone along the road. Right, so also we found that Cornell University have got a library where they've got some very interesting information, because Frederick Douglass, as I mentioned earlier, toured around Britain, and he was lecturing in the Queen's Rooms in Glasgow on the 26th of March. So there's so much information now. This is 1860. So much information that you can actually read the presentations, and that's fascinating. There's an amazing amount of material now available free. There's still an amazing amount which frustratingly you're expected to pay for to access, but we try to promote access to materials that are freely available. Then the Trades House Digital Library, which is another interesting resource, has all kinds of information in it, including this about slavery and emancipation. And this again is the Glasgow Emancipation Society. This is local, this is 1837, and there are notes of the annual meeting, and the different people who were there are named. It's very interesting. But I also found this, which is interesting, because sometimes the Irish, it's considered that the Irish were enslaved, but this book tells a different story about white people who were taken over prisoners to the States, and also children. So again, I wanted to flag up that that's an interesting resource, and somehow that came out of this story about Glasgow, not quite sure how. And then Ian spoke about Harriet Tata, and Harriet was in different places, touring again, this time though women talking to other women, so that's a really important story. There's interesting information there. There are local history stories about Black people who were involved in both world wars, and in Glasgow had welcomed nationalities from across the world. And as an industrial and trading powerhouse of the empire, it was a magnet for thousands under British rule. And several Glasgow-based shipping companies like Anchor Line and Clan and City Lines made extensive use of Lascar labourers. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute, and that relates to your indentured labour point, Jim. So Lascars was the collective name given to predominantly Asian seamen taken on as deckhands and engine room crew by British merchant ships in the 19th and 20th century. Many of these single men married white British women, forming the earliest immigrant communities in the thriving ports around the UK, including Glasgow. And this story is about the Hamlet family, who originally came from Egypt and wanted, sorry, I'm not reading this properly. I'll read it directly. The Hamlet family came from Egypt, unofficially occupied and administered by Britain, which wanted to protect the Suez Canal, its principal and most direct route to British-ruled India. So that story is going to be interesting to research. I have to say I haven't researched all of these. Right, so this is a little bit more about some of the issues and the riots that occurred in a number of places around the UK, including Glasgow, and then South Shields, Salford, London, Hull, Liverpool, Newport, Cardiff, and Barry. So when these places are looking at their Black history, then this is going to be one of the themes that we'll suggest that people look for. You know, was there involvement in riots at that time? Because the Black British colonial sailors were branded as unfair economic competitors by the national seamen's unions and their local delegates. And some of these stories are really awful. And I was given a copy of a book called The Fortune Men by Martin, who's one of the folks who joins our sessions. And this is about the story in Cardiff. Okay, so Indian Lascars in Glasgow. I've just picked out a couple of clips here because there's quite a lot of literature about this. So the comment in the book was that the treatment of Lascars in contemporary Scottish literary sources, as is in English sources, is sympathetic if sometimes patronising or paternalistic. And how far did this refer to the state of relations between Lascars ashore and the natives of Clydeside? And what sort of reception did these Asian visitors receive in the hands of native Scots, or what impact did they have upon the population of the city of Glasgow? And then they picked out this one point about being mostly followers of Islam, and apparently they had wanted laboratory facilities with continually running water, and then there's some more description about that. That takes me back to North Wales, and there's an interesting story in Bangor, but nothing to do with Lascars. Okay, so probably it says the word Lascar is outmoded, but it does refer to a particular group of people, and translated directly, it means a sailor from East India. But the term bears a wider applicability and was regularly used in reference to non-Europeans that sailed on British sea vessels. So there's a lot to find out about there, but there's an interesting radio play and teaching resource written by Shahida Rahman and directed by Pablo Robertson as part of an HLF-funded Lascar Heritage Project. So I've listened to that and it's fascinating. So that's something that could be used by schools. Right, then Ian talked about Ellen and William Craft. I don't really understand their story, but they managed to escape cleverly from bondage in the United States, and then they managed to get over to the UK, and I'm not sure what the link is. Probably that they spoke in Glasgow. Another story here, Scottish South African Black History links, and we haven't done a lot yet about South African history. Excuse me. So this is Dr. Mollema and his contribution to South Africa because of his close ties with the University of Glasgow, which is named a building after him. Oh, excuse me. And Andrew Watson. So there are Black footballers in different parts of the country. Their stories are worth researching. I spoke earlier about The Fortune Men, the book that I've got. And that's just a couple of summary pages at the end of the rest of the links. Okay, so I've gone through that really, really quickly. But Caroline, I know you were with us last week, and Simon was too. Do you think that presentation is something that could be used, or Jim?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Liz, as our leader, you really lead from the front. And you have given us so much material in the last 6-8 months I've been involved in this project. And it's, I still have the taste for more and more. But a couple of things I want to mention. Abu mentioned about the indentured labor in Jamaica and mentioned the Indian contribution. I think there's got to be more work on that, because in the Caribbean, and from what I can gather from talking with fellow Jamaicans and from African origin, Maroon origin, local indigenous origin, and since the enslavement and colonialism and so on, there's been some horrific stories about divide and rule, and that was the plan that was a blueprint. Wherever the colonialists went, they divided people and ruled them. And there were some bitter moments, I understand, talking to some of my Jamaican friends, about the way the coolies were treated, the Indians were treated as newcomers to Jamaica. And it was awful. And to this day, there's still some little bit of bitterness and hatred and repairing that needs to be done. And I don't know whether Bernard Yankee, my brother, can perhaps not now, at some other stage, I have to share my email. We can talk about doing some research and some of this work. Because I have visited Jamaica. In fact, I was going to marry a Jamaican woman when I was 18 from St. Elizabeth. And I made a journey over there, and her mother was half Chinese, an elderly lady with no teeth in her mouth, but she said to me, "Don't you coolie ras cross me door." So I went there with her daughter, trained to be a nurse, to marry her. And this lady, so I went to Kingston and got bloody robbed and beaten and almost bloody raped until I managed to get a flight back to England at that very, very early age. So I'd like to see some of this research. And Bernard, my brother, I'm happy to make a little bit of contribution financially to support a researcher for a month or two, so we can get some information, put it out there, because there's a bit of healing that needs to be done so we can move forward. From what Liz and others have done, it got me so worked up and anxious and happy in a way, but very frustrated that I can't put some of this together. As a writer, I can't put it together because I haven't got the energy. I'm at my age at 78, I can't remember things. I can't put things together as I want to, and it frustrates me. But if Bernard have younger people and people who can do the kind of research, same as Abu in Wales. In Guyana, there was a Wales plantation, and they hired me out to do, I was no more than 11, but I went and did some work on the sugar plantation in a place called Wales, in the west bank of Demerara in Guyana. So Wales, and I'd later discovered through this process that Wales, the Welsh have had a hand in it, and they named this place Wales. In sugar plantation, it's no longer function now, but the remnants of the mill still stands there. But the other thing is that we get people, Black people now, across the world, researchers, university lecturers, writers, and we have a discourse amongst ourselves. What you've said, and the theme has been about localizing research and involving people. And I did that in Luton. I've got a young student, I'm a governor at the University of Luton, and I got through the tutor, a young student, do some work on a basic thing of naming the streets of Luton and how they got their name. And they discovered that there were many of these people were named after slavers, tons of it, after people who commanded the slave trade and with all this brutality. It did raise some awareness and consciousness, especially around the Black churches that invited me to talk about the outcome, but then we lost it. So the final point I'm going to make, we know so much in the last 20 years. It's coming out in volumes about slavery and indentureship and exploitation in different ways, and the collusion of the rich and the poor, and even the trades unions. I'm doing some research on that. The Lascars in Wales and Boot Town and Tiger Bay and Cardiff and so on, they've gone through the similar experience that they experienced in Glasgow and different parts of Scotland, as they did in England, the Liverpool, Bristol, and everywhere else. And my plea, my comrades, sisters and brothers, we've got to localize some of this information, conceptualize it and plan it in a way. I believe a sister from Bristol did come on this program once and told us how she worked with a local church and the reverend and created local stories. And for me, that was a revolution locally. And if we can do that and put it into context and involve local people, because finally, I know the institutions are racist structurally and institutionally. They will not change, but it's campaigning bodies, whether it's a trades union or political parties, that nip away at this and create those changes, but they themselves can be affected by structural and racism, institutional racism. But if we can get local people, workers, factory workers, nurses, locally, who are involved in a political party, their trade unions, and in other ways in the community, because I believe the academics going to create a revolution is going to be the ordinary voter in a democracy, the ordinary people who would go out, not pick revolutionaries straight away, because they're, at the moment in England, they're picking Tories. But once they pick radical people and things like Black Studies, which I was a governor at the college then, which became university, in the 80s, we had Black Studies. We work and I walked and cycled the streets of Luton to get enough people interested. And then the courses died because we couldn't get people interested, but a few that attended were very enthusiastic. So that concept of localizing Black history, I think is the one that we can move forward to, because every working person now probably have a computer or access to the internet. And that's where we got to work. The academics are great. They made tremendous sacrifices, but let's involve the foot soldiers now through a local perspective. A lot of good work is done in Wales. And again, for Abu, as well as my brother Bernard, I'm happy to put a little bit of my savings, my pension, to get researchers to research on local matters that will create a structure and a framework and bring interested people together to start the discourse as we're having now and to move it on, because I think that's where the revolution is gonna take ground and take form, and we're gonna get schools teaching slavery, colonialism, imperialism, because the establishment, whether Labour or Tory in England, wouldn't do it on their own. Corbyn said he would do it, but the working class defeated him as well as the establishment. So I'm happy to help, but you can hear my frustration. I want to see things done, even though I'm going to put my own pension in it to support this work from young people who would cascade into working class people, albeit that working class people had at least to rise up against capitalism. There's generally been the Marx and the Lenin and the others from the middle class who have had good reading knowledge and ideas of history. Thanks for taking so long.
Thank you very much, Jim. Excellent. Bernard, would you like to respond?
Yeah,
and then
Jim, you have my email, because Liz had put it up on the site. So
All
if
right.
you send me an email, then we can be in direct contact.
All right, my brother.
Okay, good.
I think that would be fantastic. Jim, it's good that you're able to be joining us again now. We've missed you. Apu, did you want to come in on that? Any of those points?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks, Jim. You know, this is what it is about. You know, people who are committed to the struggle of research, etc. And Jim saying that he wanted to donate something out of his pension to this particular project. And that's what it goes to show, that intergenerational passing on that information. And as far as the educational system is concerned, you know, definitely need a lot of resources to be poured into that, to look at the narratives of different groups of people. You know, if we're looking at the coolie trade, for instance, that's a unique history, which, even though I know quite a lot about it, a lot of people, even in the educational system, don't even think about it, you know, the 1840s when the indented laborers came over, how they were treated and how they were a very positive entity during the Windrush generation, because a lot of the Indian class that came out of Grenada and Trinidad and Barbados and Jamaica came here and forgotten they were considered black, you know, because everybody was black. Hungarians were black, even Irish were black in 40s and 50s, believe it or not, you know, anybody wasn't Celtic or Anglo-Saxon. So I think that history needs to come out as well, because there's a lot of descendants from people who come from the indentured labor class, you know, maybe 6th generation now, maybe know about this history. You know, many of them have been miscegenated out, because remember, a lot of the men that came over here married local white women. You know, the names may have changed over time. You know, the complexion have definitely changed. There may be some remnants within the family history or oral tradition that they were once from this particular class. So that narrative needs to come out as well, you know, about their contribution after the enslavement period, how their labor upheld industrialization, even in Wales. So there's a lot of things that Jim said which resonate with me, of the importance of this information getting out to the young generation so they can see the multicultural dimensions that has existed for well over 400 years, you know. So that's what I would like to say. Thanks, Jim, for your offer. And a lot of the stuff you presented in the slides of that locality, this is a deficit I find, especially in Wales, with the youth within the educational system. They know more about American culture, believe it or not, Liz and Jim, than they do about their locality or their own history. You know, I gave a presentation to the Jamaica Society, the South Wales Jamaica Society, back in December, Liz, and I mentioned about the the color bar, and I associated the color bar with racial segregation in America. The color bar was racial segregation in Britain until they passed the Race Relation Act. And I was speaking to this older white woman who's married to a St. Kittian man, and she turned to me, she said, I was totally flabbergasted what you said. Even though I was a teenager in the 1960s and I knew about the Windrush generation coming over, what I did not realize it was a color bar. You know, we had elements of racial segregation till 65. And after 65, it just crystallized that there was so many changes. We started to see more and more Black people participating in many of those institutions they were never allowed to, such as cinemas, dance halls, restaurants, hotels. They weren't allowed to go to those things, but yet there was still a color bar on the housing, you know, up until 1965. So there's a lot of local history which needs to be known now, you know, because our children are being taught about what's taking place thousands of miles away, when similar things were taking place just down the road from where they actually live.
Right, thanks ever so much. That's brilliant. So this is good, this networking is excellent. So I've got to put you in touch, Bernard, with Jim and with Apu, okay?
Yeah, please.
Yes, please.
I'll write notes and then try and remember what I'm supposed to be doing. Okay. Right. Well, that was fascinating. I don't know if anybody else wants to make any comments at this moment. If not, I'm going to do something. Sorry, Vivian.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that if Jim's money could stretch, when Abba spoke about the treatment, that should not, of the Black people, that should not go unnoticed. Because although a Jamaican, Dr. Moody, was placed first in the medical class, he couldn't get a job. And he had to organize a group to work with him just how to survive. And that needs to be put on the agenda. And his brother, interesting, Ronald Moody, there is a crater on Mars to his honor. He's an artist and his work is in the National Portrait Gallery. And his brother was a famous Jamaican doctor, Ludlow Custis, etc. We have to think of Mary C. Cole. And the recognition isn't given. And Cuba Cornwallis, forgive me. Every opportunity I get, I repeat that Cuba Cornwallis from Port Royal, Jamaica. When Lord Nelson returned from Nicaragua, he was too ill to return to England, and he stayed in Jamaica a year. And it was this lady who used her healing strategies, medicine, and he survived. And he was grateful because when he returned to England, he told England's sailor Prince William, who later became King William IV, about his activities in Jamaica. And Prince William came to Jamaica and got what Jamaicans call a rub up. That is today now they call it other names, but it was a rub up, the hands. He too enjoyed what he was given. So much so that when he became a king, King William IV, he told his wife, Queen Adelaide, after a woman street in Spanish Town, Jamaica is named, about his experience. And she sent for Cuba a dress, which Cuba said was too beautiful to be worn. They should bury her in it. So there is our story. There are stories not told. And some of these need to come up, especially, and I'm grateful, I'm glad about Mary C. Cole, but there are other stories to be told. Your Dr. Samuel Johnson, his secretary, a Jamaican, and he left a substantial amount of money for him. But of course, he's not mentioned. The person who prepares the meal is never mentioned. It's always the person who benefits from the meal. So we need to put everything on the table, not some under the table. Thank you. And Liz, I'm not going to bawl today. I'm not going to cry today.
Oh. Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. I think you need to be our resident storyteller. I'm just going to move on now because I want to try something I've not tried before, and I hope it's all right with Simon. I'm going to share the screen, and I want to see if we can play this clip.
The 26th of January is not a day of rejoicing for Australia's Aborigines. It is a day of mourning. This festival of progress in Australia commemorates years of misery and degradation imposed upon the original native inhabitants by the white invaders of this country. We ask you to pause in the midst of your rejoicings and ask yourself honestly whether your conscience is clear in regard to the treatment of the Australian blacks during the period of history which you celebrate. You are the new Australians, but we are the old Australians. You came here only recently, and you took our land away from us by force. There are enough of us remaining to expose the humbug of your claim to be a civilized, progressive, kindly, and humane nation. These are hard words, but we ask you to face the truth of our accusation. We ask you to study the problem from the Aborigines' point of view. We appeal to the Australians to study the matter more deeply and to try and realise that typical Aboriginal is just as good a citizen and just as good an Australian as anybody else. We ask you to be proud of the Australian Aborigines and to take his hand in friendship. We ask you to be proud of the Australian Aborigines and not to be misled any longer by the superstition that we are naturally backward and low race. We are no more dirty, lazy, stupid, criminal, or immoral than yourselves. Your slanders against our race are a moral lie, told to throw all the blame for our troubles onto us. The cards have been stacked against us, and we now ask you to play the game like decent Australians. Remember, we do not ask for charity. We ask for justice.
All right, so NITV is our TV channel here, which is specifically for the Aboriginal communities, but it's just fascinating and highly informative for anybody else to watch. And it's managed by one of our...
Yes.
Isn't me? Apologies. Right, Jim.
Yes, Liz, I want to respond briefly to what Vivian has said. He's not in tears, but I'm about to go into tears, having seen that last clip, because that's a language in which working people who are at the GCSE level or lower level can understand and relate to the language, the style, the presentation. And that's really, really touched me, the way my brother has presented that. And that's what we're going to work with. But for Vivian, my brother, I'm not a rich man. I came to this country illiterate and poor, but I have a little bit of savings. Thank God to my white wife who worked and paid me to go and kept the house and bought the food and paid the mortgage, and kept it at university to get the scholarships and so on from the trade union. So we've managed to save a little bit, but I'm happy, Vivian, to share what I can with you, with Bernard, and with Abu. Let's two things I'm going to ask Liz to do is to put everything that we saw today on the record so we can access it, including our emails if possible. And the second thing, I wonder whether could do this. I'm happy to help out for every contributor who took part in this thing to give a 200 or 100-word biography with their contact detail about who they are, what they do, where they're at in this research and Black history. Then we can begin to interact a little bit more with each other directly, rather than going through a central framework through Liz or Simon. If you can do those two things and have ready access to sharing each other information, we can talk individually. My wife is also a retired deputy head teacher. She's done well. She's got a little bit of saving. She tried to get her school to offer scholarship to 6 students from different ethnic background, including disability, race, and gender. The school has just refused it, and we've been working towards that for a couple of years. So we got that little sum of money, the same school where my wife taught the entire career, 43 years. And so that little money is still there. And if I can share it between 3 projects, I'm happy to do that with my wife's permission. It's not a great deal, but it's there. If it can be a little bit of seed corn for investing in some researcher for a month or 2 in each of these 3 products, we can cost it out. And if I can't afford it, I'll say so, but what I can afford, we can compromise and get it done. I'm too old, I'm too frail now with all this illnesses to do much, but I want this work to continue. I feel so bitter against slavery, colonialism, exploitation. You know, my mother never turned on the tap for water, never turned on the electricity switch, never wore a pair of shoes. And for generations, my people, my sisters suffered, married drunken men because they had no schooling, and brutalized all their lives, having up to 17 pregnancies and the children dying in front of them. Perhaps I'm bitter, perhaps I'm frustrated, but I want work to be done and to continue to raise awareness and consciousness. So it's us 3 can email each other and contact each other. I've still got, by the way, all these books behind me, barrels of it I can't get rid of. I'm offering to people to put in community sort of libraries and ordinary rural community libraries and so on. And I want to do my bit, but I'm not making a lot of progress. Liz has given me the information of people, one from Kent, and I've offered them books and things, clothing, food, whatever I can. I've got too much of everything in my old bungalow here, in my garage. It's no good to me. I could kick the bucket anytime. I want to share it, including what I've got on my computer. All my research about poverty, about racism in the Labour Party, the unions in the world. I've saved almost every heading I have. I want to give it away. I want to share. Thank you.
Okay, well, we're going to ask you to save your breath and keep going for a bit longer. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jim. I mean, what you're able to contribute is just amazing, both practically and in another way. Lovely to see Marcia join us.
Sorry, I can't apologise enough for being late. I knew I'd be late, but I wasn't sure how late, so I do apologise.
All right, you've just made it. Okay, so that's really wonderful. And Jim, thank you so much. And I know you've had issues recently over the winter time, and it's good to see that you're back with us again now. And in the meantime, I hope you feel that we have focused and we have got a way forward to use all the information that we're collecting up. On the website, I started a page where people could put their email, or you have to tell it to me, well, I know it, and a short bio. So that would be the best way if you want to be there and you give me some information, then I'll just sort it out so that you know which page to look at, and then you can put your contact details there and then contact one another. Helen.
No, it's just to say thanks, Jim. I think you're in the same situation we are. When you kind of think, I've got things that I want to offer, and whether it's, kind of financial books or expertise and that, and you reach retirement and you're suddenly out of that kind of professional loop. Listening to what Abu Bakr was saying about the work in Wales and that, it is that kind of thing that I think it would be a good idea for us to be able to share, if it's not financially, but certainly share our skills, our knowledge, our experience, so that the work can go on. So thanks for putting into words what I've been having on my mind for quite a while.
So much. Apu, did you want to say anything?
Yes, there certainly is, what Helen was saying, what everybody was saying. It is a need. I think there's, especially with curriculum change happening now, I think we need to push to have more youngsters going into the fields of humanity, especially where history and anthropology is concerned, because there's not enough youngsters going into that profession, unfortunately. And I think that more, if there's more engagement, more research by these youngsters, they can see their potential, because the unfortunate reality, which I find as an educator, with the way that history is being taught in school under the national curriculum, that many of the students found it boring. They never found any form of connection between, what took place 70 or 80 years ago and how does that relate to the contemporary. Because teachers literally had to just rush through the material without laying context and, within the content. And that's the unfortunate thing. And I think we've lost a lot of students as a result of this. But, with a lot of scholars that has come out of our countries, the likes of Marcus Garvey, Ivan van Sertima, Jan Carew, and all these other people, Edward Scobie, and the list just goes on. We know these names, yeah, and we've built on their information that came out of the Caribbean, and that information now needs to be disseminated within the educational system. Local kids need to know their links with these types of narratives, and for them to feel that this information is going to propel them into the future, as a sense of being practitioners and keeping this alive, because that's what it's about. Every one of you talked about trying to keep this alive, passing on this torch, this historical torch from one generation to another, that this is never forgotten or repeated again. And that's the whole point of it. So thanks for that. And that's all I really wanted to say. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Marcia?
Yes, sorry, it's just to ask, is this about creating an online Black history directory of resources? Am I picking up the wrong thread? I'm not sure.
I think you're jumping ahead a little bit faster.
Yeah, because I've come in halfway, sorry.
Idea, okay, but definitely that's a really good idea.
Oh.
And I can see, Bernard, I can just see all those books behind Jim. I can just see them all in the Jamaican Memory Bank. Other resource
we're always happy to get material in. Always
we
happy.
have very good connections with the Jamaican High Commissioner. So, Jim, I think if we have some further conversations about this, we can set up a special Zoom meeting. Yeah. And Bernard and Vivian, I'm sure, will talk to you and progress the ideas, and Abu Bakr Madden may well join in too. So you started what you were saying, Jim, by saying that Jack Charles, who is the actor, the Aboriginal actor who presented that piece, you know, it is so moving, because Australia is a country that already had Australians living in it, and it's been taken over by white people who even imposed a white Australia policy and wouldn't allow other people from other countries around Australia in this part of the South Pacific to come into Australia. And our immigration museum is fascinating here in Melbourne. Not been to it for a while, but really is amazing. So I wanted to show you that clip, and then if it's all right and you'll bear with me, I just want to share with you how I, oops, is this working? Yes. That, yeah, Australia, there we are, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Okay, so that presentation was done a couple of years ago. Now, the 26th of January is Australia Day, and it is about celebrating, you may be amazed to know, it's about celebrating the invasion, celebrating Captain Cook arriving on the east coast of Australia in the Sydney area. And Australians love it because it's a national holiday. White Australians love it. And it's a time for the classic Aussie barbecues and fun and big parades in all the cities organised by the city councils. But interestingly, when I first came here and was a bit more naive about things, I went to see what the Australia Day celebrations in Melbourne were about. And they were mainly about the communities that have come in since the White Australia policy ended. And they were celebrating their cultures, whereas the Aboriginal people and their allies and supporters were in a park in another part of Melbourne celebrating Survival Day. So it's really a highly contentious issue, but year on year over this last 10 years, I've seen the Aboriginal voice become much clearer. And I won't read this long thing out, but just that it's there. This is the official thing about Australia Day, is time to reconnect and walk together. And there are a lot of good words being said, but there's also a lot of other issues that need to be followed through. So this, I talked about the acknowledgement that I do at the beginning of the sessions. So what's the difference between country with a little c and country? Well, country is really, really important to consider, meaning a homeland or tribal or clan area, and a word for all the values, places, resources, cultural obligations associated with that area and its feature. Because Australia had many nations. Australia is huge, so, you know, bigger than Europe. So imagine all the European countries are all these different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So they're still connected to the country and still feeling decidedly aggrieved that white people take the lead over here. So remember Burrum Burrum. We've talked about this already. So Wednesday morning, I got up really early because there's always, they're very keen on breakfast and dawn celebrations here. So I watched the telly from the crack of dawn, and this is on NITV, which is a subsidiary of SBS. So it's like an ITV series channel, but it's a special channel. And they were in all notice we're all socially distanced, all the folks, and the guy in the middle was interviewing other people and asking questions all through the day while we listened and watched the surfers in the background. It was great. So officially though, and I'm showing you Sydney here, the Premier of Sydney, who's in the top left-hand one, gave an inspirational speech from his perspective, and he had some Aboriginal performers and supporters there. Also in Sydney, bear in mind we've got such problems with the pandemic at the moment with Omicron, but anyway, they all went ahead with all this activity. The guy with the mask on at the bottom, he designed a way of telling the story projected by lights of the parenti lizard. And it was presented in the morning, like really early, while it was still dark. And the story of the parenti lizard moved on the sails of Sydney Opera House. It was pretty amazing. I hope to be able to watch that again and maybe find a way of sharing it with you. So those are sort of official things going on. It was also 50 years since the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. And for those of you who've never heard of it, like me, 50 years ago, Uncle Gula Michael Anderson, he was one of the co-founders of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. So these young people came to the old Parliament building and they set up a small tent, and they had their placards. They hadn't really thought, they would just felt that Australia needed to know that they weren't happy, that they were looking for reparatory justice. And there is an anomaly, which means that the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, despite the authorities, has never been able to be moved on, because this land outside the old Parliament building is public land for anybody. And so year on year, they've just quietly stayed there and quietly made the point. So you can find out more about that if you want to. Then different communities around the country use the opportunity of Australia Day to raise particular issues, and the campaign against youth incarceration of Indigenous peoples is something that's very necessary, because many young Aboriginal boys particularly, but girls as well, get into trouble with the police because their cultural perspectives are so different and don't fit in with other norms. And Dondale Youth Detention Centre is a place that they want closed down. The government, however, is putting lots of money into building a new detention centre, which has got better facilities next door. This is a gentleman who designed the flag, and it was copyrighted to him. I think he sold the copyright, and there were all kinds of issues that the Aboriginal people couldn't use the flag which they'd accepted as a joint flag for all their nations. So it was really important that the government bought the copyright at great expense, and now everybody can use it as they need. And here you can see other campaigning activities going on, you know, just saying what's required. I can't begin to go into the range of injustices here, the stolen generations, the land grabs, just horrendous. And I've told you earlier that Captain Cook got his self-painted red at St Kilda. And throughout the day, we were entertained with artists and activities. And this wonderful lady, I loved her singing, but I loved her t-shirt, Teach Black History, Apple Bagger. Yes, I thought of you. And this gentleman sang so beautifully and told the stories through his songs in a way that people can understand. And then the rest of the day, well, there were various films that are often shown, including the fabulous, well, it's not fabulous, it's just such a traumatic story. If you haven't seen The Rabbit-Proof Fence, then you need to understand how awful it was for those stolen children. But this particular one I thought was useful to share, because we've talked about the Benin Bronzes being returned from museums to their countries of origin. In this case, the National Geographic film crew and experts from the Smithsonian Institute in the United States visited Australia, and in the northern part of Australia, northern Queensland, they took a lot of interest in the heritage and took an awful lot of stuff away. They also took the bones that were traditionally kept in caves in the hills. So the programme explained how this gentleman felt that it was absolutely wrong, and he single-handedly, well, with colleagues I'm sure, campaigned, and the Smithsonian Institute eventually agreed to return the bones. And 3 of the communities in that area, because they didn't know whose bones had been taken, and the Smithsonian Institute didn't know. It turns out the Smithsonian Institute got bones of people from all over the world there for their research. It was just horrendous. It's really distressing. My little granddaughters came in halfway through, and we did have to switch off at that stage. But you can see in the top left picture the people who went to collect the bones, and the people at the Smithsonian very reverently put them into boxes, and people took their flags and they took them back. And then interestingly, because we've had a speaker about bark cloth earlier on, they showed how the bark was stripped off the trees and the bones had been identified as being male or female. So the male bones were buried in one part and the female bones were buried in another part. But before the bones were buried, they were painted with ochre. I haven't shown anything that I think would be insensitive to any first Australian person, any Aboriginal person in these pictures. So the bones then were wrapped up into bark cloth, and then they were buried in that way. And the picture underneath shows 5 years later that land is now just, that it was in a cemetery area, because they said that they couldn't return the bones to the places they'd been placed before, because they didn't know whose bones were whose. So you can see I've just said their archival footage. So the National Geographic have got, and part of the film was showing, and the Smithsonian Institute showing the pictures that they'd taken of their trip. And they obviously had Aboriginal guides with them, but the bones were taken out of the caves while the guides had their lunch break, and so they were not aware that they'd taken them. The Aboriginal guides had showed them out of respect that this is the way that they things were when the elders passed. That was very, very traumatic, really. So don't forget, look out for the rabbit-proof fence. So that was my Australia day. All right. Well, I hope that was of interest and shared a bit there about my culture here. Okay. Well, thank you. Is there anything anybody wants to ask? Does anybody know what the rabbit-proof fence was?
No.
Well, at one stage, the protector of every area in Australia had a British protector of Aborigines. And the British protector of Aborigines had the right, and police and officials, to take the children from the Aboriginal communities.
Oh my God.
To the missions. These children, there are some children who are still of those stolen generations, and it's just awful, just an awful story. And there were people from before. So the idea of the British was that they would take them away from their culture, from their families, from their homes, physically grab them, ride on a horse and grab them, maybe put them in a vehicle. And then these mission stations were set up by Christians all across Australia, from different nationalities, German ones and French ones and British ones. and the missionaries didn't treat them very, very well at all. It was a miserable life. So 3 little girls decided that enough was enough. They didn't want to stay at this mission any longer. So they set about escaping, and they knew of something called the rabbit-proof fence. Now, the British introduced rabbits to Australia, and the rabbits cause major problems. Invasive things here are just dreadful, plants and animals. So they decided that they would try and get rid of the rabbits on one half of Australia or part of Australia, and then they would put a fence so that the rabbits couldn't get through. It's called a rabbit-proof fence. So they built these rabbit-proof fences, the British, all across Australia. But these girls knew that the rabbit-proof fence was near the mission, and the rabbit-proof fence was near where their home was. So they decided to follow the rabbit-proof fence and find their way back home. And it took, I don't know, weeks or months. And they 2 of the 3 of them made it back home, but they were being sought by the Protector of Aborigines and all his people, and they had Aboriginal trackers trying to catch them as well. But these little girls, and they were like little, not, I think the oldest one was about 12, they managed to make it, and their mothers and grandmothers sensed that they were coming. They sensed, and they waited until every night they went out away from their homes, because the Protector of Aborigines was watching them there, because they were thinking the girls were trying to get home. And so they went out, far out, and then they met the girls. And these girls, I think one of them's still alive, and I think the other one passed not so long ago. But it's and the film, The Rabbit-Proof Fence, which you can see, I'm sure, on YouTube, is a most moving and disturbing piece of creative work, and the acting in it is absolutely fantastic. So that's that story. But if we don't know the stories around the world of what the British were doing, we can't begin to put it together and get some kind of understanding of what the British empires and the other European empires were up to over those years, hundreds of years. So Marcia's put, hi everyone, in Applebaggers, put lots of things going on in the emails here. Let me just go in the chats here. Right, Simon's been putting in about some different good movies as well, so we've got information there, so we'll leave that on for a bit, and I can add these to the website too. That's good, thank you. And
got to go.
Thank you very much indeed for that information. Can we put that on the website? Yeah, okay, so Jim's had to go now, and thanks ever so much everyone, because it's been a longish session, but thank you for letting me have my moment in the sun. Okay, yeah. We wrap up the recording now, and we can chat some more afterwards.
Yeah.
We need to. Marcia?